When you think of Lanzarote, you're probably picturing cheap pints, a bit of sunburn, and the big resorts down in Puerto del Carmen or Playa Blanca. You're almost certainly not picturing brutal medieval killing zones. But the jump from a desperate blood-soaked outpost to the ultimate British holiday machine is actually a pretty wild story. Today, I'm looking at how this island completely pivoted from fighting off pirate armadas to building some of the biggest purpose-built tourist towns in the Canaries.
So behind me is the Puente de las Bolas. It looks like the entrance to some sort of romantic fairy tale castle, right? But practically speaking, this was a desperate fortified killing zone. It's the only stone drawbridge of its kind in the whole of the Canary Islands. Built back in the 16th century, it was designed to be the ultimate checkpoint in defence against invading pirate fleets. And it saw some pretty horrific stuff. In 1586, a massive armada of Algerian corsairs attacked the city. The local defenders guarding this exact 10-metre span scrambled to pull up the wooden section of the bridge, but they were too slow. The pirates breached it and slaughtered the entire garrison right here on these cobblestones. It's kind of hard to reconcile the peace and quiet around here with the absolute bloodbath that happened. The bridge is named for these two massive stone balls resting on their pillars. Simple name, brutal reality. This is the Castillo de San Gabriel. It looks like it's perfectly positioned. It's on this isolated little rock called Islote de los Ingleses, surrounded by the Atlantic, and it can only be accessed by these two bridges. But its history, in terms of its effectiveness in defence, is pretty shit. They basically came with lots of operational problems when they were attacked. Sometimes their cannons wouldn't be working. They would frequently run out of ammo. Not the most glorious history, but you've got to remember it was mostly untrained, mostly inexperienced militia trying to defend this island against much larger, much more advanced forces. In 1583, an infamous pirate showed up here. Legend says that when the militia scrambled to fire their only working cannon, it took too long, and as it was burnt out of wood, it was burnt to the ground. Now, when it was rebuilt in stone, as you see it now, that was financed by taxing the local salt production, which went down really well with the locals, considering they were already being raided by pirates all the time as well.
Trying to defend the coast back then was a complete shambles, to be honest. The pirate raids got so bad that the locals basically packed it in and retreated inland.
This town was founded in the 1400s, inland, quite high up, away from the coast. Not for the views, but to keep the inhabitants safe from pirates, which were quite a problem in Lanzarote. This church dates back to the 15th century, but it's been set on fire and ransacked by pirates multiple times. Back in the day, the number of steps that you had leading up to the front door of your house indicated how wealthy you were. More steps, more money. I think the Kardashians lived in this one. 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, loaded. But all the money in the world couldn't protect the people here from what was about to happen. Every Sunday, thousands of tourists and locals flock into Teguise for this huge market that takes place in this square behind me. Mostly tat, to be honest. But this little alleyway leading to it is called Callejón de la Sangre, Alley of Blood. During another one of the many pirate raids, the defending forces managed to corner the invaders in this alley. And it didn't work out well for them. Apparently there was so much blood, it was like a river flowing down the cobblestones.
For a long time, living in Lanzarote was basically just about scraping by. You were dodging pirates, getting through droughts, and trying to survive some fairly apocalyptic volcanic eruptions. Because the island was so incredibly harsh, the locals had to jump at absolutely any lifeline they could get. So when the 20th century rolled around, the island faced its biggest invasion yet.
Lanzarote opened for international tourism a bit later than Tenerife and Gran Canaria, extending its runway in 1970 to allow the introduction of international flights.
To see exactly who came flooding through those airport doors, you just need to look at the island's biggest resort. It's the place where the entire makeup of the island was completely rewritten in the space of a single decade.
So in 1970, the tarmac of the runway gets poured, the big jets can land, and the floodgates open. Before the planes arrived, this was a sleepy little fishing village called La Tiñosa, but right as Lanzarote was opening its doors to the world, the British package holiday industry was going into overdrive. In the 70s and 80s, British tour operators were desperately looking for new places to sell to the British public who were tired of dreary winters and disappointing summers. Compared to the already crowded coastal resorts like Benidorm, Lanzarote was essentially a blank canvas. And because British tour operators were bringing in the vast majority of early tourists to the island, they essentially bankrolled the growth of places like Puerto del Carmen. This town didn't grow organically. It grew specifically to cater to the exact needs of the people getting off those planes. That created an incredibly fast feedback loop, which meant things like British pubs, English-speaking staff, and supermarkets importing products that the Brits loved. The more the town catered to British tastes, the more British tour operators marketed Lanzarote as a home away from home, with year-round weather, and the more Brits arrived on package deals. The economy cemented itself around it. It wasn't a slow mingling of cultures, it was a rapid, purpose-built economy. Puerto del Carmen became the laboratory for Lanzarote's tourist boom, and that initial 1980s blueprint completely hardwired the demographic DNA of the island. Once the British ecosystem was established, it never left. So looking at the math here, the population of Lanzarote in total is under 170,000. Pretty small when you compare it to Tenerife, which has a population of just under 1 million. Because the baseline local population here is relatively small, foreign residents make up a significantly larger proportion. In fact, 1 in every 4 people, about 25%, in Lanzarote aren't Spanish. Now for years, the largest expat community here was the British. So why did the Brits choose Lanzarote? Well, unlike Gran Canaria and Tenerife, Lanzarote and neighbouring Fuerteventura don't have a massive central mountain range. And for that reason, the weather here tends to be a bit more consistent because the mountains aren't trapping the clouds and forcing the cooler, wetter air back down. In addition, the unique aesthetic of Lanzarote, as a result of César Manrique's rules, made it an attractive place for families looking to live somewhere that wasn't a concrete jungle. But even though the Brits have been knocked off the top spot in terms of permanent residency on the island, of the 3 million or so annual tourists to Lanzarote every year, over 51% of them are from the UK. So for that reason, places like Puerto del Carmen still feels like Little Britain. The full English is still on the menu, John Smith's is still being poured, and the stamp of the UK stays permanently on this volcanic rock.
Seeing this massive influx of concrete and British pubs exploding along the coast, local artist César Manrique realised he had to step in before the whole island turned into another Benidorm. He helped design Costa Teguise just up the road, basically trying to force mass tourism to play by his strict aesthetic rules. But as we got into the late 90s and 2000s, Lanzarote realised that it needed to adapt again. Visitors wanted something a bit more premium. To see what they did next, you have to head right down to the southern tip of the island. For over 100 years, the only thing away down here was a lighthouse, sitting out here on this barren, rocky coastline. Now, the old lighthouse has been completely swallowed up by the island's newest moneymaker.
I've come down to the very southern tip of the island now, and if Puerto del Carmen was built for the 80s package holiday crowd, Playa Blanca is the newest addition to Lanzarote, and it was built for the 2000s villa crowd. It's a bit more polished, a bit quieter, and it represents the upmarket pivot that Lanzarote made to ensure its survival. The British presence here is less like a loud pub crawl and more like a nice retirement. Playa Blanca represents the most recent evolution of Lanzarote's tourism machine, upscale, polished, and perfectly designed for that permanent spring. To understand what makes this island so special, look at what's sitting right next door.
Literally a few minutes down a bumpy dirt track from all those villas, you hit the beaches at Papagayo. There's no concrete down here, no English breakfast signs, just natural, untouched coastline. It shows you what this part of the island would have looked like before the tourist boom. And the fact that this completely raw, protected landscape is still sitting here, right next to the island's newest resort town, is pretty cool.
So what would Manrique think of his island today? Well, he'd probably hate the traffic and the souvenir shops, but seeing the modern tourist engine that exists here, that still centres around the national park, Lanzarote is the only place in the world where you can have Little Britain and the surface of Mars living in perfect, whitewashed harmony. And for that reason, you have to say, he won.
From a desperate blood-soaked outpost to a landscape completely buried under millions of tons of lava, right through to becoming the beating heart of the British holiday machine. On paper, Lanzarote shouldn't really work as well as it does. But thanks to a determined bunch of locals and the sheer willpower of César Manrique, it somehow pulled it off.